Welcome. Our guest today is Nils Muižnieks, whose career offers a unique lens on human rights and social advocacy. Many of you will know him from his term as the Council of Europe's Commissioner of Human Rights. He later built on that work as Amnesty International's Regional Director for Europe, and he currently holds the crucial role of UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Belarus. Closer to home, he also channels his expertise into local development as the director of the Social Entrepreneurship Association of Latvia. Nils, welcome. I'd like to begin with your current work on Belarus. Your mandate on Belarus provides you with a unique perspective on the country's human rights situation. In your expert assessment as a UN Special Rapporteur, has the repression in Belarus now solidified into a permanent state, or do you see any viable pathways for its reversal?
Nothing is permanent, especially Mr. Lukashenko. Mr. Lukashenko has been in office now for more than 30 years, and I don't expect him to be there for another 30 years. So at some point, things are going to change. The problem, of course, is that he is not alone. There are many little Lukashenkos around him. I think the current darkness and severe repression that we see is relatively recent in origin. It's basically the real crackdown began in 2020 after the fraudulent elections, the protests, and then the huge crackdown. Before 2020, there were no political prisoners in Belarus. Yes, the occasional opposition politician would disappear, but you didn't have 1,100 or 1,200 political prisoners as you do now. That's all very recent. I don't foresee that this is a permanent state. I think we have to be ready for when change does begin, either when Mr. Lukashenko tries to hand over power to somebody else, or if the economy goes into such a nosedive that instability emerges, or if the end to the war in neighboring Ukraine is such that it spurs political change. We have to be ready, and we have to seize the opportunity for a democratic transition when that window opens. And this is something I've been telling to the Belarusian exile community and to the international community as well. This is not a permanent state, and we have to be ready for change. And the human rights monitoring that we're doing now hopefully will play a useful role in creating a better Belarus in the future.
Wonderful. And given your answer, my next question is a practical one. And the Belarusian justice system seems to have been fully weaponized against dissent. And what specific tangible mechanisms beyond declarations and sanctions can, in your opinion, the international community still employ to support Belarusian civil society and, of course, the hundreds of political prisoners that you mentioned?
Well, Belarusian civil society within Belarus has been destroyed or driven underground largely. So it's quite difficult to support anybody within Belarus without endangering them because of the current wave of repression. Belarusian civil society in exile, though, is quite vibrant. It took a hard hit when the United States cut the Agency for International Development funding. Belarusian exile community, especially media outlets and youth groups, were very hard hit. And so for the last few months, I've been urging European donors to step up and try to fill that gap. And that has happened to a certain extent, which is good. But there's still a need to support politically, financially, morally, Belarusian civil society in exile. I think the way that I see my role is to try to keep Belarus on the agenda. It's so easy for Belarus to be overshadowed by the horrors of the war next door, by other political developments. So I see my job as keeping it on the agenda, because if it's not on the agenda, if it's not on the news cycle, if it's not on anybody's mind, then it's much easier for the Belarusian regime to get away with atrocious human rights violations. We have seen a new approach from the Trump administration of trying to engage the Belarusian authorities, and it has led to some changes. It has led to some releases. The releases have been problematic because the releases have sometimes been of people right near the end of their prison term. They earlier on they were accompanied by a requirement to do propaganda videos. Early on, they were accompanied by forced cooperation with the KGB. More recently, they've been accompanied by expulsion from the country to neighboring Lithuania, and sometimes without any travel documents, leaving these people at risk of statelessness and complicating their lives severely. So they haven't been trouble-free releases, but there has been the release of several hundred people, including many political prisoners, which I think is interesting. And the Belarusian exile community wants both engagement and pressure. Sometimes these two strands of policy on Belarus can come into conflict with each other, but I think that both are needed. I think it's, not too many governments in Europe want to talk with Mr. Lukashenko. They would rather see him in The Hague. But I think that the American approach has shown that engagement can accomplish something. At the very least, some people's lives are being saved. So I think there are a number of things that can be done now. I think we have to watch closely what the Americans are up to and make sure that they inform their European colleagues who are more directly affected by events in Belarus than America is.
Thank you. A key part of this context, of course, is the fact that Belarus has isolated itself from most regional human rights mechanisms. I mean, given this, what role can the United Nations system play?
Well, they've isolated themselves from me and my predecessors as well, because they have not let me into the country. They respond to my communications, but very often in a very perfunctory, formalistic way, without providing information that I've requested. One other United Nations body that has an important role to play is a group of independent experts on Belarus, which is an investigative body that has been working in parallel to my mandate for the last year. And their focus is on accountability, on gathering evidence of international crimes committed by the authorities in Belarus, so that in the future that this evidence can be used to ask for accountability within the Belarusian legal system, which doesn't seem very likely in the near future, but also in other jurisdictions as well, whether that be in cases of universal jurisdiction, whether that be cases at the International Criminal Court, just yet to decide whether it's going to pursue an investigation on a referral made by Lithuania. So this group of independent experts has been gathering such evidence, and I think that this is an important mechanism for future accountability. What more can we do to bring human rights violators to account? I think one is to give victims and survivors of torture, survivors of human rights violations, a voice, to document these violations, and to keep reminding the world that this is a dark place for human rights, and that there are mass violations going on there. I counted, if you look at Belarus in the broader context, it probably has more political prisoners than any other country in the world per capita. If you look at Turkey, if you look at China, if you look at Russia, there are, of course, many political prisoners there. But if you look at the size of Belarus's population, 9 million people, then the number of political prisoners is very, very high. And I would even submit that it's the highest in the world per capita. So this is why this documentation needs to continue to take place, so that when the opportunity arises, that we can call those responsible to account.
What are some of the problems that the lawyers, Belarusian lawyers and human rights defenders face on a daily basis in Belarus?
Well, most of the human rights defenders are either in prison or in exile. Lawyers have been basically brought under state control. The bar associations are no longer independent. Now they've now become arms of the government, which means that the bar associations are in the business of disciplining their members, of spreading propaganda from the state, and of keeping their members in line. What it means is that if a lawyer takes on a politically sensitive case, he's quite likely to fall afoul of the authorities, and himself or herself be prosecuted on various charges. You have very vague laws on counterterrorism and counter-extremism, which have been weaponized to basically stifle any dissent. And a number of the prominent lawyers that had taken up politically sensitive cases have ended up in prison themselves on these trumped up charges. So it's very difficult to be a lawyer, and it's particularly difficult to be a lawyer taking up cases that have anything to do with human rights or politics.
Well, unfortunately, Belarus is not the only country where lawyers and human rights defenders come under immense pressure from the government. For example, Turkey, in Turkey, thousands of lawyers have been prosecuted, detained, and convicted in politically sensitive cases, especially since 2016. Do you see any parallels between the persecution of lawyers in Belarus and Turkey or elsewhere? And what lessons do you think can be drawn from these?
Well, I think that first of all, the differences in the context should be underlined. I think Turkey is in the Council of Europe, whereas Belarus is quite isolated internationally. Turkey still has civil society organizations, some free media outlets. It still has bar associations, which are fighting to maintain their independence. In Belarus, civil society and independent media and bar associations have been destroyed. But the trend in Turkey is quite bad. I think the authoritarian toolbox is quite similar. The opposition politicians being put in jail, a noose being tightened around civil society, independent media, and lawyers are scared away from politically sensitive cases. The parallel that I see more often though is with Russia, I think, where lawyers have a very difficult time taking on politically sensitive cases. But there, I think that Russia's further along down the path of authoritarianism than Turkey is, so it's probably even worse. But I should not trespass on the territory of my colleague, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Russia.
Okay. And like you mentioned, Turkey is a party to the European Convention on Human Rights. Yet we see rulings from the European Court of Human Rights are being ignored frequently by Ankara. And from your unique experience as the former Human Rights Commissioner, how can the Council of Europe maintain the credibility of its core human rights protection mechanism when a major state like Turkey consistently defies it?
Yeah, I think that we have to look at different mechanisms within the Council of Europe. Some, I think, have more credibility in Turkey than others. I think the commissioner, at least in my time, and I think afterwards as well, has been quite vocal in calling out human rights violations and urging Turkey to uphold its values. I think the Parliamentary Assembly, on occasion, has done a good job, but not consistently in calling Turkey to account. I think where the monitoring mechanisms as well, I think, have done relatively well. But where the Council of Europe has fallen short, I think, is the Committee of Ministers and the European Court of Human Rights. I think the Council of Europe, especially the European Court of Human Rights and the Committee of Ministers, has failed Turkey over many years. I think Turkey has remained a member in good standing despite coups, gross violations, judicial complicity in those violations, states of exception, criminalization of dissent, and the court the court has found individual violations, but it has not wanted to see the broader pattern, the broader trend, and to call that trend out. And there are some calls from within the court, to take a more activist stand, to have the court move faster, to take a broader perspective, and to speak more boldly. I think Judge Pavli recently came out with such a call, and I think that the court can do more. I think that the Parliamentary Assembly can do more in terms of its monitoring, in terms of calling to account the Turkish authorities. I think the Secretary General, ironically, has never used the one tool at his or her disposal, which can really target a country, which is an Article 52 inquiry, requesting of a country why it's not fulfilling its obligations. And I think that the Parliamentary Assembly and the Committee of Ministers could really stand up and ask for much more from Turkey. So I think that there's a lot of room for improving the credibility, but I would urge a differentiated look at the different bodies of the Council of Europe.
Okay. And of course, the situations in Belarus and Turkey are unfortunately part of a larger global pattern of pushback on human rights situation, often framed as a defense of national sovereignty or traditional values. Having worked at the heart of Europe's primary human rights institution, how do you believe this is coordinated and well-funded? This coordinated and well-funded challenge be countered?
Well, I think there are a number of different ways. I think that I spent a lot of time when I was commissioner looking at how we can better communicate human rights, and I've tried to focus on this in my current work on Belarus as well. I think we have to up our game on communications, because the authoritarians are very good at using communications. They're very good at using social media. They're very good at grabbing people's attention and manipulating people's emotions. And I think that we have to be on the side of human rights and democracy. We have to be just as good, if not better, than the authoritarians. I think another aspect that where we have failed or we have not done enough is to address some of the root causes for this authoritarian wave. And one big cause, I think, is inequality. Inequality between and within countries, where the human rights movement has not paid enough attention, I think, to the corrosive effect of inequality on human rights in general and on democracy in particular. And this goes back to the old discussion about kind of the second tier nature, or the second of social and economic rights as compared to civil and political rights. And I think we have not devoted enough attention to social and economic rights and to inequality. I think another thing that we have not been good enough at doing is to expose the corruption and socioeconomic failures of authoritarian regimes. Because in addition to inequality, it's kind of outrage at corruption, I think, that has fueled a lot of the populist movements. And if we can show that the authoritarians are more corrupt because they're less accountable to civil society and the media, because they've silenced civil society and the media, that they're corrupt and they're also failing socioeconomically, that this is one way to bring around the support again for human rights and democracy. And I think what I tried to do when I was commissioner was, when I saw a country backsliding, restricting media, restricting the work of civil society organizations, to call that out immediately, because the role of civil society, independent civil society, human rights defenders independent media is so critical for the functioning of the human rights system and for democracy. And we have not been loud enough and quick enough. I looked at how, in some of my academic work, I looked at how the Council of Europe responded to democratic backsliding in a number of countries. And the backsliders are quite astute at learning from each other and pretending to have dialogue with the Council of Europe while dismantling democracy, the independence of the judiciary, the independence of public service broadcasters, muzzling civil society. And they do this very quickly. And they pretend like they're cooperating, but in the end, they're not. And we have to be, I think, far more agile in calling them out and at every step of the backsliding process.
I mean, one of the major drivers of this pushback is the weaponization of information. During your tenure as the COE's Human Rights Commissioner, you were one of the first senior officials to warn about the dangers of fake news and the erosion of trust in institutions. How has your analysis of this threat evolved, and where do you see the most promising regulatory or civil society-led efforts to combat digital surveillance or disinformation?
Well, artificial intelligence had just near the tail end of my mandate had begun to emerge as a factor, and I would say that the context, the overall context, has worsened in a number of ways. Not only because artificial intelligence has emerged as a major factor, and it's impossible to tell now fake from real pictures, fake from real videos, and that really complicates the job of those trying to fight against disinformation and kind of manipulation. But I think also the social media scene has deteriorated in the last few years. The example of X or Twitter under Musk and the kind of the deterioration there that we've seen. Remember, a few years ago, Twitter was such an important platform for news, and now it's become a big mess, such that many people no longer use it. I think also the political context has become worse. The success of far-right parties, kind of the willful kind of denial of truth and facts and science, I think, is much worse now than it was 10 years ago. And on top of that, the international climate has changed such that in Europe, we no longer have to fear only Russia as being an enemy of European democracy. We have to fear the United States as well. And that's a completely new challenge. But I think that there are a number of promising initiatives. I recently looked at for a project I was doing at professional outfits struggling against disinformation. And there's some absolutely wonderful organizations out there doing really interesting work on fighting human rights disinformation. For example, an outfit called EU Disinformation Lab, or Bellingcat, which has done some great work on Russia in particular, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, or the Center for Information Resilience. These are all outfits that are doing threat detection, analysis, prevention, training and education, digital forensics, and debunking of disinformation. They're doing a really good job. I think it's can we link up all of these initiatives and scale them up so that they have the kind of impact that we need? That's the big question. Regarding digital surveillance, I think there's some great work being done by NGOs as well. I think Amnesty Tech is doing some good work on digital forensics as Citizen Lab and other NGOs. So I think that there's a lot of excellent initiatives out there fighting against these very negative trends that we're seeing. And sometimes they're winning. We're winning.
Thank you. And we'd like to talk about UN Human Rights Council as well. From your vantage point as a UN Special Rapporteur, what do you see as the most crucial structural or political issues currently challenging the Council's effectiveness? And given these challenges, how can the mechanism of special procedures remain a credible and effective tool?
Yeah, I think the Human Rights Council was supposed to be a club of countries that were better at human rights than their colleagues. It's turned out that that is not really the case always, and you have a number of serial violators as members
Mhm.
of the Human Rights Council. But that's a long-standing issue, and that will be very difficult to see. Regarding special procedures in themselves, I think one problem is that there's been a proliferation of special procedures, um, such that you have, I think, about 15 country mandates and about 45 thematic mandates, and then a number of working groups. And this proliferation, I think, sometimes it is well intentioned by people who think that certain issues deserve attention, but sometimes it was clearly ill intentioned. It was meant to create a structure that couldn't function, that wouldn't have adequate funding, um, and that would be kind of difficult to maintain. And I think you also have an overlap. Some of the special procedures mandates have overlapping mandates with each other, and some of the special procedures have overlapping mandates with investigative bodies. I mentioned before that there's not only is there a special rapporteur on human rights in Belarus, but there's an investigative body as well. And that's fine as far as it goes. But if you have this kind of parallel mandates for
Mhm.
a number of different countries, and you have a budget crisis, that means that none of it is going to work eventually. Um, there's a huge discrepancy in staffing and funding between different mechanisms as well. For example, I know that the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine is massively understaffed. They had to let go many of their staff because they were not on permanent contracts, and they have no money to travel to Ukraine. If you have no money to go to the country that you're investigating, what is the point of having an investigative body? And I know that some of the investigative bodies are huge. They have staff of up to 80 people, whereas others have almost none. So it's a very imbalanced field. And on top of that, now you have the liquidity crisis. We were supposed to have next week, we were supposed to have a gathering of all the special procedures in Geneva, but it has been canceled this year because there's no money. So the structure is there's too much duplication within the system itself, and this current liquidity crisis might actually lead to a rationalization and optimization of that. I just hope that because there's no point in having many structures that have no money to do the work that they are tasked with doing.
Mhm.
Um, I think that the ambitions need to be scaled back a bit. The funding needs to be there. Otherwise, there's no point in having a number of structures if there's no funding. So these are the problems I see in the way that the current setup is.
Thank you. Very insightful. But Nils, finally, I'd like to conclude by by looking at your work closer to home. You have recently taken up the role of the director of the Social Entrepreneurship Association of Latvia. Um, it is very interesting. How do you assess its role and impact in addressing systematic issues like poverty, regional disparities,
Well,
or
I'm
integration of marginalized groups?
yeah, thanks. I'm very new in this position, so I'm still learning. But I find it fascinating because it's a it is a field of work that runs in parallel to human rights work.
Mm.
It deals with many of the same issues, social inclusion of various marginalized groups, um, issues pertaining to climate change, issues pertaining to migration, but from a very practical, down to earth way. Social enterprises are businesses whose priority is having social impact. Where I see their biggest role, at least in the Latvian context, is in promoting integration of various groups into the labor market, especially persons with disabilities. There are strong incentives for them to do that. They get various tax benefits, and there are various financial programs they can access to do that, and they do a good job with that. I see when I look at social enterprises in other countries, the two big areas of work that are kind of growth industries for social enterprises in other countries in Europe is climate change and migration. You have many businesses providing providing goods or services that are working in and around climate change, in and around migration, and are doing great work. And I see them as having a huge potential, especially because they are businesses and they don't rely on, or at least they don't rely solely on grants from, to continue their work. They're supposed to be functioning businesses that are earning some money and reinvesting their profit into their social mission. And as funding for NGOs is being cut across Europe, I see social enterprises as being able to pick up some of that slack to take some of these issues forward, and to innovate socially, to help some of the most vulnerable people in Europe. And I'm quite excited, to be working now with the association that tries to support these social enterprises, tries to lobby and defend their interests before the government and local governments, and to inform the public about the good work that's being done.
Wonderful. We are going to follow its progress with great interest. And Nils, that concludes our interview. Thank you very much indeed. We greatly appreciate your time and profound commitment to human rights issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much.